as they are set out in the Samoa Pathway document. Colleagues, small island developing states continue to face unprecedented transboundary challenges, made worse by our limited resources and compounded by our inherent vulnerabilities. The escalating and worsening impacts of climate change have exposed the limits of our adaptive capacity. SIDS represent two-thirds of countries with the highest relative annual losses due to natural disasters. These factors compromise the prospects for economic growth and development. It is a Sisyphean task, no less. Even as our situation worsens, the political support that we should have continues to wane. The necessity for an immediate and large-scale global response is apparent, but the global system for financial support has taken a turn to the detriment of SIDS. There is an increasing shift from grants to loans with additional conditions and criteria attached for access to these funds. 8 SIDS are categorized by the World Bank as high-income countries, 25 as middle-income, and 3 as low-income countries, based on a GDP per capita basis. Many of these middle-income and high-income SIDS are heavily indebted and all remain inherently vulnerable. Neither these nor the other unique circumstances of SIDS, including size, limited resource base, high dependency on natural resources, and high exposure to exogenous shocks, are factored into the World Bank's criteria. Similarly, the UN's pivot to the private sector does not account for the limitations and barriers that have stymied private sector engagement in SIDS. These include high-risk profiles, high transaction costs, uncertainty in returns, and limited capacity to identify the risks associated with these investments. There is a clear need for a differentiated approach to development cooperation with SIDS. We believe that philanthropy has an important role to play in this regard. There are numerous philanthropic organizations whose interests are closely aligned with those of the global causes championed by SIDS. This is especially obvious in the environmental context in respect of ocean conservation and sustainable use, sustainable fisheries management, and climate change. There is also the potential to build on good practices in that context, to apply more broadly, to forge new partnerships in the development context. The Samoa Pathway is the Sustainable Development Blueprint for SIDS, and it outlines key action areas for which SIDS require support. This year, on the 27th of September, we are undertaking the high-level midterm review of the Samoa Pathway, identifying the progress made as well as gaps and challenges where further support is required. The review process has been comprehensive. In the second half of 2018, we had regional meetings encompassing all relevant stakeholders to identify issues relevant to the specific SIDS regions. And then one interregional meeting, which collectively brought all common priority issues together. The outcome document emerging from this review to take place on the 27th is to be based on the findings of these preparatory meetings. High amongst the issues that SIDS have identified and which we hope to see articulated in the outcome document is access to adequate means of implementation that can be delivered in a timely manner to our people on the ground. This requires capacity building in some cases to improve understanding and to support informed decision making, and in our cases to improve how we monitor implementation, which can further support improved decision making. It also requires appropriate technology and technological know-how to enhance our absorptive capacity. And it goes without saying that ultimately it must result in delivery of support, preferably concessional support, through direct access modalities, such that we continuously reinforce the capacity of the recipient without compromising depth, sustainability. Examples of high-impact philanthropic intervention in SIDS are a starting point for engaging with philanthropy. In Belize, we can reflect on numerous entities, both local and international, that have supported our cutting-edge approach to sustainable fisheries management. Our government in Belize pioneered the first collaborative approach with local NGOs for the first of its kind National Managed Access Program for commercial fisheries. Along the way, we have had the support of the Environmental Defense Fund, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Nature Conservancy, and the World Wildlife Fund, amongst others. Our countries are exploring collaboration to launch sovereign blue bonds, other countries are exploring collaboration to launch sovereign blue bonds and green bonds with the support of philanthropy. We should then, through this webinar, aim to examine how we can leverage philanthropic work in small island developing states to expand the scope of partnerships and also provide a proof of concept for how such collaboration can be applied globally. As the situation stands, vulnerable countries such as small island developing states are very much at risk of being left behind as the world progresses into a new era of development. Therefore, I would strongly encourage exploring further ways to strengthen SIDS-focused support and partnerships. And please spread the word as widely as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yang, for bringing the main challenges, also referring to the global framework, the Samoa pathway, and especially for already showing examples of concrete actions as the one you referred to in Belize. I am aware that you need to leave very soon, so I will open the space now for those that might have any questions to Ambassador Yang. You might type them on the Slido app, or also you can feel free to use the chat box. While we do so, we already have a question on Slido that I will present to Ambassador Yang, if I may. And it is, what is the best way for foundations to share their relevant work with the international community most effectively and without unnecessary reporting burden? Ambassador, if you have any comments or any insight on this question, we would really appreciate hearing them.
It's a good question. I think that the SIDS partnership platform, where partnerships are registered, because actually philanthropic work is a partnership with the countries or entities that they're working with. So I think the SIDS partnership platform is the best way to register what your philanthropic organization may be doing. It's not an onerous reporting platform, very easy to follow, and I think that it will then give the researcher, especially Marjo Vieras, who actually analyzes the partnerships, more material to go on to show us where we are going and what can be done. So I think that the SIDS partnership platform is the way to do it.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I don't see any additional. Oh, there is one question. Great, thank you so much, Dave. Is in the example of Belize, Ambassador, I read it for you. In the example of Belize, can you clarify how philanthropy played a role in the development of the fishery sector? What is there a Belizean philanthropic entity that was engaged?
In the fisheries section, we have the examples I gave was our managed access program for commercial fisheries, and the local NGOs are philanthropic, and they helped to formulate along with the government plans that enable the local fisher folk to participate in this managed access for commercial fishing. I don't know the names of the NGOs, but it was a collaboration between these philanthropic NGOs and the government's plan to manage fisheries. And we were able to bring on board the local fisher folk who are very happy with this managed access to commercial fishing.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So I don't see any additional questions, and I think you provided us also the very good leeway to the next presenter. Ambassador, I know you need to leave. If there is anything else you need to say, otherwise I will really thank you very, very much for taking the time and joining the webinar today.
And I thank you too, and I will review the webinar script and see what comes out of the discussions going forward. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So colleagues, we are moving forward to the second presentation, and it's a very nice follow-up from Ambassador Young's presentation. I want to invite Mario Viejos, Director on Coastal Policy and Humanities Research Associate, and also part of the NERIOS program from the University of British Columbia, and who will be talking to us about the gap analysis of SIDS partnerships, and this discussion about where can the philanthropic community make the most difference for SIDS. Mario, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning from Vancouver to everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm speaking about the SIDS partnership analysis that was undertaken in preparation for the Samoa Pathway Review, and it's one small component of that. And the purpose of it was to help countries prepare for the midterm review of the Samoa Pathway, but also to provide them with a better understanding of the partnership landscape. And it was very much based on the SIDS partnership that Ambassador Young mentioned in her talk earlier. So the questions that we asked in this review, firstly, what is the status?
I'm sorry, there is a background noise. We're just trying to identify. Perhaps we can mute everybody and then just unmute.
But I appreciate your time.
Yeah, colleagues, if you were not speaking, please mute it. We have a lot of colleagues on this call, but there is a background noise. Please do not turn on your mic. You can go on like participant or audio. Participant, mute Paul, and then just mute
Quite a lot quieter now. So
Mario, I think you are on. You are on now, and I think you identify the background noise. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. So the questions that we asked in the review was, what is the status and trends of SIDS partnerships? And how have these partnerships addressed the Samoa Pathway priority areas, which are very broad and relate to sustainable development? And are there some underrepresented areas, which is particularly important to know? And then what is the impact of these partnerships on their beneficiaries and sustainable development of SIDS? And that was a very difficult question to try to tackle. We also looked at the challenges as well as lessons learned for the next generation of partnerships. We looked at over 600 partnerships with SIDS, most of which are online in the SIDS Action Platform, and also were informed greatly by the global partnership dialogues that have happened yearly since 2015, as well as the regional and interregional dialogues in 2018, interviews, regional reports, and other materials. So there was a lot of material that fed into this analysis. The final version is out as a hard copy as well as online, and it's part of the broader SIDS partnership toolbox. Next slide, please. So this will give you a little bit of the flavor of what's in the analysis. We looked at some of the numbers of the partnerships, both by region and then SIDS partnerships globally, which are partnerships that include more than one SIDS region. And what we found in this, without getting too hung up on these numbers, that the Pacific region had most of the partnerships, while the Atlantic Indian Ocean SIDS had the least number of partnerships. But in all regions, these partnerships had grown in number from the 2014 SIDS conference where they were established to today. But also many of them had been completed in the meantime, which provides us then with a lot of experiences and lessons learned can be applied in the future. These numbers are mostly indicative, and they are likely actually an underestimate because not really every partnership is something that we would know about on the global level. The main entities that lead these partnerships, governments, regional organizations, and UN organizations. You have NGOs and civil society, private sector, scientific community participating in these partnerships as well, but to a lesser extent than governments, regional organizations, and UN organizations. Now, in terms of the funding and the philanthropic participation, there are many partnerships that have as their partners philanthropic organizations. There are also many partnerships that are backed by the bigger funders like the Global Environment Facility and its implementing agencies. Next slide, please. So how do these partnerships then address Samoa pathway priority areas? All of these the priority areas addressed, but unevenly. And in most regions, oceans, seas, and climate change are well addressed. These are high priorities for SIDS, and they have also gathered momentum through, for example, the UN Ocean Conference in 2017, where many entities and countries registered voluntary commitments. There's also many partnerships on sustainable economic growth, sustainable and renewable energy, and disaster risk reduction as well. So progress is being made in all these very important areas, but that does not mean that more attention in these areas wouldn't be needed. There certainly is more room for work there. Many partnerships had tangible on-the-ground impacts that furthered the implementation of Samoa Pathway. These were impacts such as direct impacts on beneficiaries, for example, communities gaining better access to water and sanitation. There are also direct impacts on the environment, for example, through putting in place protected areas or, say, fisheries management measures. There was improvements in knowledge, information, data, and indicators and sharing of data as well in a more open manner. Improved coordination between agencies and organizations was the result of almost all of the partnerships. Improved capacity similarly was a very common result. And many also built a positive policy environment, for example, getting youth involved in policy making or providing policymakers training on empowerment of women, those kinds of partnerships. Next slide, please. So then the underrepresented areas, and what there weren't really as many partnerships on, although there were often some in each one of these areas, but they were not comprehensively addressed. Aspects of social and economic development, in particular addressing inequality, and this was things like income inequality, marginalized groups, youth employment, those kinds of priorities. Also, partnerships that addressed multiple dimensions of poverty were underrepresented, and this is a very difficult area that requires many sectors working together and would require sustained investments in human capital, such as education and health, food and nutrition security. Also, sustainable transportation. There were a few projects, partnerships, but not as much as perhaps was expected. And things like low carbon, low cost options for communities in remote islands are incredibly important for many of these isolated islands, for both for transport of humans and goods. Water, wastewater, and sanitation. There were many partnerships on this, but many of those also had come to an end. So there's a lot of room to perhaps pick up on where some of those partnerships have ended. Health and NCDs. there was only one partnership registered on NCDs. There was a global partnership, but there is a lot of activities in countries on this topic, and perhaps assisting countries with their NCD-related activities and priorities is one area. Gender considerations, why there were partnerships related to gender. There is room for more work on income equality, women's participation in the workforce, and women's leadership. There are a lot of partnerships on the ocean, but less so on terrestrial areas, and particularly integrated ecosystem management that would focus on whole islands and the connections between the terrestrial environment to the watershed and to the sea, and linking that to human livelihoods. And also there's more room in sourcing development finance for SIDS, and particularly the room for use of innovative financing. Next slide, please. So then thinking about the philanthropic sector, and some ideas on, from my part, on how the philanthropic sector could contribute, and perhaps through fostering partnerships around some of these underrepresented areas that I mentioned, such as inequality, poverty, health, sustainable transportation, gender, etc., but also partnerships that work across disciplines. And here's one area where I think new ideas and fresh thinking could be also brought to the table when supporting these innovative and multidisciplinary partnerships. There's a lot of good work happening on the local level, and this is not always reflected on various UN platforms as well. That championing these very creative local level solutions is certainly one priority as well, and assisting smaller partnerships working with civil society, communities, or local governments. But also at the same time thinking big and supporting actions across interconnected ecosystems of people, integrated management of whole islands, and the ocean that connects the islands. And finally, I think science and science collaboration is extremely important, and fostering long-term science and innovation, which feeds then into policy, and building scientific research capacity and collaborations around SIDS priority issues. So these are some ideas from me, and I'll just leave it here and say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario, for this great presentation of the SIDS partnerships that are reflected in the DESA's data bank. I think the contributions and the gaps that you analyzed, they also reflect some of the messages from Ambassador Young. Also, this message that there are more out there. There's a lot happening on the ground, including in partnership with philanthropic organizations, and how can we also capture this in the partnerships data bank that DESA is supporting to collect and supports the implementation of the Samoa pathway. We will be providing more information about how to register the partnerships later on during the webinar. I want to invite colleagues to keep uploading your questions on Slido or the chat box. We will be coming back to those after the presentations. And let me move straight to Ms. Heather Gray, the Vice President of the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Heather, thanks so much for joining us, for collaborating in the organization of this webinar. The floor is yours now. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much, Heather.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining. Let me first just say a couple of words about Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, which we shorten to RPA. We're a nonprofit. We were established 17 years ago and one of the original philanthropy advisory services. And we now have about 55 staff in 4 offices in the US and the UK. We began working on the SDGs already more than 5 years ago when we created the SDG Philanthropy Platform with UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and the New York-based Foundation Center, now known as Candid. And we came together with two goals: to ensure that the philanthropy sector understood what the SDGs were, and that they engaged much more in the SDGs process than they had in the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them. And the second goal was to ensure that governments and the UN system appreciated the importance of the philanthropy sector as a partner within the SDGs. Our SDG philanthropy platform in these intervening years has done work across many different countries. We have almost 10 focus countries that we've worked in around the world, including Brazil, Colombia, India, Indonesia, Ghana, Kenya, and Zambia, and the United States. So these are all countries where we have built out partnerships, and we created a flagship approach called Collaborative Pathways in these countries. If you'd like more information about this, you can visit our website, sdgphilanthropy.org. And we also have a website that was created earlier that gives an incredible amount of data on which foundations are supporting the SDGs, and that's sdgfunders.org. I want to also just take a minute to define what we mean in RPA by philanthropy. So we don't mean our target, our constituency, we consider those who are providing funding. It's not necessarily all the philanthropic work that happens by grantees and nonprofits and social organizations, social enterprises around the world, but it's those that are providing resources. And we focus in RPA on institutional giving, but of course there's a lot of individual philanthropy and community philanthropy that happens as well. But my talk today will focus on how institutions and individual givers who have set up some kind of a giving vehicle can work more effectively to support the SDGs. Okay, next slide, please. So after operating the SDG philanthropy platform for these years, we realized that philanthropy really needed more tools to really be an introduction to the SDGs, and then really practical tools that would help them to align their work. So in April this year, after about several months of work on it, we published two guides that help foundations and other funders use the SDG framework within their grant making, their measuring, and their reporting processes. And they're actually relevant whether you're giving grants or an operational foundation. The first guide is an overview of the SDGs and how to get started. And the second one provides very practical tools for how to collect and measure and report on data. I just want to add here that I think it follows on very nicely with the previous speaker. These guides and our resources at RPA are very helpful for philanthropy in general in engaging with the SDGs, but I can see that they're particularly important for small island developing states and those who are giving there. It's partly because we see there's a limited amount of philanthropy that's going to those areas, and we hope that the amount will increase. But also in SIDS, we find that the interconnectivity of different SDGs is really prominent and essential. So for example, thinking about the effects of climate change on poverty, or the interrelationships between health and inequality. So I think it's really, we're very delighted to be participating in this webinar today specifically on SIDS. Can we have the next slide, please? So just to start with, there are some very easy ways that funders can support the SDGs better, and we've included 4 of them here. First of all, when funders are soliciting grantees who might want to get support from them, and then creating their portfolios and talking about their work, funders can include SDG language in proposal guidelines, in grant documentation, and portfolio descriptions. Secondly, building active partnerships within and across sectors on priority SDGs. And I think, again, we've just had a wonderful example from Mario Vieros talking about how there are SDGs that are very well supported in SIDS, but then there are others that are very neglected. So these are the areas where we would encourage foundations to really expand their partnerships. The third is to engage with the public around the SDGs. This is an interesting one because I think it's been apparent to many of us that as the SDGs were being consulted around and then launched and then begin to be implemented, the philanthropy sector was a bit late to the table. So governments and the UN system, of course, were very involved. Civil society organizations across the world were very involved, and increasingly business was very involved. So, but business and civil society has really found many, many ways to communicate about the SDGs to their constituencies. And we think that philanthropy can do more in this area as well. And then the fourth way that we think would be possible would be using blended finance and impact investments to achieve the SDGs. This is a growing area of interest amongst foundations and family offices and so on. Next slide, please. So I just want to go through three overall steps that foundations can think about. The first one is in planning. First, thinking about your foundation's priority program areas and making a list. Then the next step would simply be look through the 17 goals to find the closest matches. The third step is to dive into every SDG that you selected to find which targets your philanthropy aligns with. And there's a wonderful tool that we developed years ago called the SDG Indicator Wizard. And you can simply type in the name of the program you're working on or your program purpose, and it will tell you which SDG and target you're supporting. And fourth, to consider human rights principles or other cross-cutting and intersectional dimensions that support that goal. So, for example, issues around inequality or on SDG 16 around inclusive societies, think about those intersections. Next slide, please. The second overall step is to assess progress, and here we have five different parts. First, assessing the state of your own monitoring and evaluation framework. Where are you now? Secondly, deciding on what measures you want to use and what data you want to gather. Third is making sure that you've built the capacity to collect the desired data. Fourth is to collect, analyze, and synthesize data on a regular basis. And fifth is to synthesize that data and use it for learning and action. And I should just say here that in our guides, there's far more detail on each of these. So I'm just going over the overall steps. Can I have the next slide, please? And third and last is reporting and using data. Here we want to make sure that people are considering the needs of their stakeholders, and I have a couple of examples of that on the next slide, but I'll come back to that. Reporting on data. A lot of foundations, and this comes back to one of the questions in the chat box, foundations don't have to do much extra work to share their data because all the time they're collecting a lot of information from their grantees. So we just want to make sure that they're sharing, incorporating, and creating reports that others can use, and organizing it by SDGs makes it much easier for people to find it. And finally, to invite feedback and iterate on the collection of data and the use of it. Next slide, please. So here I thought I would end with just a couple of ideas about how we show in the guides the type of data, who's using the data, how are they using it, and what do they need. And that helps us to think about what kind of data we want to collect. On this page is your internal and field stakeholders. And the next slide, please. The next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, that one, yes. And this last page here is external institutions and individuals. So that would be reporting out to governments, to UN agencies, and to the public. And I just want to end by saying, relevant to SIDS, I think in particular, some of the wonderful philanthropic funds that are operating, one to mention in particular is the Climate Justice Resilience Fund that was established by the Oak Foundation and supported by the Candida Foundation. You can go on our website, sdgphilanthropy.org, and find many other resources about the philanthropy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather, for this presentation and for the concrete ideas of how to frame and how to for how the philanthropic sector can work with SIDS and also the broadest SDGs perspective and approach. I just want to say that we will be also sharing the PowerPoint presentation and also collecting the links that you mentioned, Heather, because I think that having access to the documents and the tools that you shared are very important for us, so those that are attending the webinar. I'm mindful of time, so let's move to work on the ground, and let me invite Mrs. Rosalia Hamilton, CEO of Lascaux Chin Foundation, for her for the presentation, the following presentation. And after Rosalia, we will be opening for more Q&A and exchange. So colleagues, please go to Slido or to the chat box. Rosalia, you have the floor. We can't hear you. Okay, you are unmuted now.
Can you hear?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. The Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance, we emerged out of collaborative efforts to address a range of development challenges facing the Caribbean. Over the past 2 years, foundations in Jamaica have collaborated under the leadership of Caroline Mafu from Grace Kennedy, and she's done a great job in doing a number of collaborative events, including a Wings Peer Learning event in Jamaica in April this year. And it provided a great opportunity for Caribbean foundations, mainly grant makers and corporate foundations, to meet and to interact. And we discussed, among other things, the private sector's role in achieving the SDGs. In fact, we used the Philanthropy and SDGs publication that Heather just referred to, and we looked at Target 12.6 that encourages companies to adopt sustainable practices and to achieve and to integrate sustainable information in their reporting cycle. And so we asked that important question: what does this sustainable practices and sustainable patterns of consumption and production mean for the Caribbean? And we thought that we really need to address these persistent development challenges that have faced us over the past 60 years of our political independence. And in considering the reporting obligation, I highlighted in a presentation at that forum the 2017 GIR research project. And if you go to the next slide, it highlighted a study that asks the question, can corporate reporting help end poverty? And we know that this is the first SDG, ending poverty. And the report provided a very important conclusion, which is that the private sector needs to move beyond philanthropy and community engagement towards strategies with large-scale impacts. And so we looked at that and thought that to address these persistent development challenges in the Caribbean, the private sector and the corporate foundations should pursue targeted, deliberate strategies with large-scale impact in order for us to really seriously tackle the sustainability by 2030. We agree that it cannot be business as usual, and we need to move beyond traditional approaches to philanthropy and corporate engagement. So we recognize that we need large-scale financing and partnerships, not only regionally, but internationally, including with members of our diaspora. And so the high-level political forum special event on philanthropy and the SDGs that was organized by UNDESA in July presented a great opportunity for international engagement. And I had the opportunity to meet with representatives from UNDESA, and they provided great encouraging support, especially in light of the global efforts to accelerate achievement of these SDGs. And so since then, we've agreed on our goal, mission, and objective, and that's in the slide that you see there, where we want to, as our broad goal, foster sustainable Caribbean development, engage in activities that will enable us to achieve our full potential, our mission to foster the partnerships and collaboration among corporate leaders, foundations, individual philanthropists, and other philanthropic entities, and also to harness, in our short to medium term, to harness financial and other resources required to accelerate achievement of the SDGs over the next 10 years. And our team to do this, we have, it's listed in the slide. I don't know if you can see it. I just quickly say it's myself, Caroline Mafu from Grace Kennedy, Dave Kaulesa from the Caribbean Association of Industry and Commerce, Kiran Maharaj from the Media Institute of the Caribbean. We have an advisor based in New York, Milton Speed, who's been doing great work in philanthropy over the past few years. The next slide summarizes what we envision. We want to network private foundations and philanthropists, and we have a database so far of about 40 organizations representing about 7 Caribbean countries. We have a WhatsApp group of about 20 individuals, and we plan to build a web presence. But our ambitious goal is a Caribbean legacy funding project that would support some key regional initiatives. And so we thought we would use the period of the General Assembly to organize a philanthropic forum and a reception, September 26 to 28. And this will be co-hosted by UNDESA and the UN Office of Partnerships. And in preparing for that, we have already started sharing a survey to assess how foundations will want to accelerate their activities. And so we're going to talk about some core initiatives, and we will, of course, talk about financing, especially social impact financing. We've heard previous speakers talk about blended financing and green bonds. All of that will be part of the conversation. And when we finish with the New York meetings, we hope to organize regional meetings that will follow up some of the conversations and commitments, really enable us to agree on some core initiatives, and ultimately to launch all that we've been doing in the first quarter of next year. And so the last slide really talks about these core challenges that we are trying to grapple with. Our economic growth, sluggish and mixed in some cases, but we need to address our indebtedness and to deliver the kinds of decent jobs for unemployed workers, especially at-risk youths. You know, we see an youth unemployment rate of about 25% in the region. And last year, CDB reported that 12 out of 19 Caribbean member states are carrying public debts higher than the IMF's sustainable threshold of 50% GDP. Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, Rosalie. Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello?
I can hear.
Yes. Yes, I think we just got interrupted. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So the second area was addressing our historical inequities. And here, you know, these inequities have contributed to a number of social problems. I want to just highlight high levels of criminality. 7 out of the 12 most murderous countries in the world are found in the Caribbean. And of course, we know that that clearly contradicts the kinds of objectives in SDGs. In fact, and there was an IDB study last year that pointed to a murder rate in the region moving from 22 per 100,000 in 2017 to 35 by 2030. And of course, you know, we want by 2030 to significantly reduce all forms of violence. So we're really concerned about that. And lastly, concern about preserving the environment. Of course, Ambassador Young talked about the financing challenges there that SIDS face in terms of this threat to climate change. And I just wanted to say here that, you know, all the predictions suggest that by the end of the century, the Caribbean region will see increasing in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, including a 66% increase in hurricane intensity and a rise in sea level. And of course, the impact of Dorian on the Bahamas is but the latest evidence of this. Of course, our thoughts and prayers are for our brothers and sisters in Bahamas. So let me end on a more optimistic note. I think that we envision that over time, the Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance will facilitate more sustainable financing for Caribbean development and enable us to better collaborate with more efficient and impactful developmental outcomes. That's our goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalia, for bringing this concrete, action-oriented perspective from the ground. We have around 10 minutes for Q&A. So we have a few questions, one in the chat box and also a few coming through Slido. Colleagues, please feel free to come and register any questions. So there is one on the chat box from Jamilia Crooks. What is classified as a partnership coming out of the presentation on the SDGs? I think Mario might be the best person to address this one. So what type of partnerships were reflected in the database? Also, there is another okay. Okay. Okay, and then we have another one that you might be able, and all the others, if there is any example of partnerships on SDGs and non-traditional enterprises like media. So I'll go to Mario and then I'll check if Heather or Rosalia wants to reply. And then there is another question that I will address afterwards. Mario, over to you.
Okay, that is actually a great question on what constitutes a partnership. And it was actually a question that was much debated in the various regional and interregional meetings as well. And if you look at the partnership database, it does contain a wide variety of different types of partnerships. And in debating this and what makes a good partnership specifically for SIDS, the various meetings put in motion development of something called the SIDS Partnership SMART criteria. And essentially these SIDS partnerships should be SIDS specific, so addressing some of pathway or SDG priorities for SIDS. Be measurable and monitorable, so monitoring and having a baseline against which to monitor were very important. They should also be achievable and accountable, and resource-based and results-focused, and have a timeline for implementation as well as be transparent. So this is the SMART criteria. And there's actually a lot of training materials that have been developed around this. And so I would point you to the SIDS Partnership Toolbox, which is online, to have a more in-depth look at what has been done around this question.
Thank you very much, Mario. I see another question coming that perhaps Rosalia can address. It's within the Caribbean Alliance, how are service clubs that fund community-based projects considered? This one is coming from Ellen Campbell, Rizzo. So how are service clubs that fund community-based projects considered? So Rosalia, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ellen. So many of the foundations have direct relationships with many of these community-based organizations and service clubs and fund them directly. So the thinking at this point is, as we develop efforts to build pools of funds that would be accessible not only through foundations that in turn can fund these organizations, but depending on the nature and the scale of the project, other NGOs and community service-based organizations can perhaps access them directly. This is part of the discussion we will have in New York as to just the arrangements one would put in place. But for now, we're trying to focus on building partnerships and creating the interest that can agree on and put together the scale of funding required for these large-scale projects.
Thank you very much, Rosalia. Heather, I'll come over to you and see if you have any reflection considering the questions that have been presented.
Yes, I'd like to, why don't I talk about the philanthropy support for non-traditional. I wanted to mention 4 examples. The first one is The Skoll Foundation, based in Palo Alto here in California, they do some interesting work with media organizations on the SDGs. And I think a lot of it really is trying to increase awareness amongst the philanthropy sector, business, and the wider public about the importance of partnerships around the SDGs. A second example is Humanity United, which does some work on ending, and Omidyar in general, some work on ending modern day slavery. And that work supports nonprofits, media, governments, business, so really across all different sectors on that very important target under SDG 8. A third example would be the END Fund, which is a really interesting philanthropic vehicle. It aggregates funding from a lot of different types of funders for work that includes, for example, direct services, research, advocacy, and that also would include media and social enterprises. And the fourth is a foundation in Brazil, Marinho, which also works with a television station, Globo TV, that has done a lot of popularizing of the SDGs for the Brazilian public. So those are four examples, I think, of creative use of different types of grantees by foundations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. There is one question that I will try to address, and I wonder if we have the slide with how to register, because we are running out of time. So we have a question about, would the review of the Samoa pathway be available for public comment or distribution, and if there is still access to the event on the 27th of September? This question comes from Dave. Thanks so much for the question, Dave. So as you know, during that week in New York, it's the week when heads of state they are in town. So every single event, especially the official one, the participation is very limited. For the Samoa pathway, the registration for non-governmental officials, it has been closed already, and the confirmed participants have been notified. However, all the events will be webcast, so you can follow lively from wherever you are from the UN Web TV. They will be showcased. Also, member states, there will be an outcome document that member states, I think they are finalizing negotiations so far, and this will also be made available soon. So this is the answer to your question. And my colleague Mang, thanks very much for posting the link on the chat box. Also, after this webinar, if we hope you got very inspired about registering your partnerships with small island developing states, we have the slide with the link where you can go and have and register your partnerships and see the details and any information. You can also have access to the toolbox and the report that Mario has presented, and we will be posting this presentation on our website as well. I see that we are reaching 12 p.m., so I will just give the floor back 1 or 30 seconds each for our speakers. I'll start with Mario, if you want to say any final comments.
Just to say thank you very much for everybody. It's been really inspiring listening to the presentations and also the questions. And indeed, if you can register your partnership, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. I will go to Rosalia next.
Yes, well, I just want to thank all of you for taking your time to listen to this discussion. Very useful information. And just to say a very special thank you to the UNDESA team for including us in this webinar and for the great support that you've given us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rosalia. And last but not least, I wanted to invite our partner and collaborator in setting up this workshop and amongst other events. Heather, any final words, please?
Yes, I'd just like to say to have everyone remember that collaboration takes extra time, but it's worth the effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So colleagues, feel free to reach out to us anytime after this call if you need any information or any questions. We are here to support. And I will end up thanking my colleagues at UNDESA, especially Mong and Luisa, for supporting with setting up this webinar. And hope to see your partnerships registered soon. Thank you very much.